Thank you, Mr. President. Insofar as today in this hall, in addition to you, there are many other senior accomplices of the Kiev terrorist regime present who bear full responsibility for its crimes. I wish to first and foremost touch upon where your actions have led us to today in the context of the Ukrainian crisis. Before our very eyes, the tragedy is being worsened, the root cause of which was what was provoked by the United States and their Western allies. In the best colonial traditions, the anti-constitutional coup in Kiev in 2014. People who, since then, led the Kiev regime were guided certainly not by interests of Ukraine. Contrary to the aspirations of the majority of the Ukrainian people and for the advancement of Western fixations on confrontation with our country, they abandoned peace and good neighborly relations with Russia, a non-discriminatory approach with all nationalities residing in Ukraine, and began by leaps and bounds to advance rabid nationalism and to whitewash Nazi war criminals. Having unleashed 9 years ago a brutal war against Russian language-speaking residents of Donbass, the Kiev regime deliberately and in a targeted way brought the Ukrainian crisis to the point of military confrontation with Russia. Our country had to protect those eliminated by Kiev in the eyes of the so-called civilized Western world, the people, women, children, and the elderly, after Ukraine and its Western sponsors definitively refused to comply with the Minsk agreements, which were approved by the UN Security Council. And as we know perfectly well today, all of these years, this document was a mere smokescreen for Ukraine's preparation by Western states for war with the Russian Federation. For this reason, all of the incantations of our Western colleagues about the alleged unprovoked Russian aggression and the war of choice no longer persuade anybody. Those who are capable of objective analysis can see perfectly clearly that we had no choice, and the time bomb that was detonated on 22 February 2022 was programmed by the West at the minimum in 2014, and actually even earlier than then. Mr. President, as is known, in April of 2022, that is a little more than a month after the beginning of the special military operation, Ukraine rejected a peace plan which was signed onto by its negotiators to resolve the crisis, a plan that stipulated, among other things, international security guarantees for that country. This happened, as we all are aware today, with a direct participation of the United Kingdom, the then leadership of which persuaded the leader of the Kiev regime that with Western support, Ukraine would manage to secure victory over the Russian Federation. Then was when the hot stage of NATO's proxy war against Russia to the last Ukrainian fully materialized, and Ukraine essentially was transformed into a private military campaign that was hired by Washington, London, and Brussels. And for there to be no way out for the Ukrainian authorities after the withdrawal of Russian troops from Kiev as a gesture of goodwill against the backdrop of the signing in Istanbul of draft peace agreements, an appalling, in essence, and clumsy in implementation provocation was organized in Bucha, Kiev, as many experts believe have assessed a direct role in organization of this was played by British intelligence services. As for whether or not this is true, an objective investigation which we will carry out will show this. As we all remember, during the British Presidency of the Security Council in April of this year, once again using underhanded procedural maneuvers, prevented a meeting that we requested in connection with this provocation from being carried out, thereby showing itself to be unworthy of presidency of the Security Council and a permanent member of the Security Council, and presenting itself as an accomplice of the Kiev regime. The provocation in Bucha was a necessary smokescreen, which the Ukrainian leadership hid behind instead of peace, choosing to engage in armed confrontation with Russia, and Western countries, instead of diplomatic efforts, have redoubled their efforts to provide assistance and Western weapons to Ukraine. The cost of this fateful decision for Ukraine was hundreds of thousands of dead and maimed young Ukrainians who today the Kiev regime continues to throw into the meat grinder in the eastern and southern fronts, vainly attempting to present to Western sponsors the ability, so-called, of Ukraine to win. And I wish to take this opportunity of the presence of ministers and to emphasize the responsibility of your governments for the ongoing tragedy endured by the people in Ukraine. By systematically inciting that country to engage in war with Russia instead of implementing the Minsk agreements, you were guided by your own geopolitical interests solely in seeking to weaken Russia. For this pipe dream, you engaged in provoking the Kiev regime totalitarian dictatorship to unleash war against its own Russian language residents in the east of the country. For 8 years, you didn't notice how the Ukrainian shells resulted in deaths of women, children, and the elderly. And today, these people are dying as a result of what you have provided, long-range shells and missiles, because Ukrainian ones are no longer reaching Donetsk and other cities. In principle, they have been depleted. And for the suffering of civilians to be even worsened, you've decided to provide the Ukrainian services with the depleted Ukrainian munitions and cluster bombs. And also, you decide not to notice the shelling of Zaporozhye plant by Ukrainian forces, as well as the devastation of the Kakhovka Dam and the open terrorist attacks in Russian territory, which reflect the terrorist essence of the Ukrainian authorities. Today, we learned about the latest terrorist attacks of the Kiev regime targeting the bridge in Crimea, hundreds of kilometers from the area of hostilities. As a result, 2 innocent Russians died, and their 14-year-old daughter was gravely wounded. I have not heard any condemnation of this act of terrorism from any of the Western sponsors of the Kiev regime, and we still have to get to the bottom of the degree to which, in the preparation and conduct of this terrorist attack, there was complicity of Western, including British intelligence services. Far too much points to this. Colleagues, all the facts that I've mentioned points to the fact that there are no crimes that the West is unwilling to commit to preserve its hegemony in global affairs in order to, as was said by Mr. Borrell, for at any cost to preserve the idyllic garden for everybody else to continue to live in jungles. And there are no principles that you are unwilling to breach to achieve this. And I'm saying this for you to harbor no illusions that your countries, including your governments, bear equal responsibility, if not more responsibility, than the Zelensky regime for what is happening in Ukraine. And despite your attempts to portray yourselves as the defender of the poor and fortunate Ukraine, your actions give the lie to your claims. And the actions of the Kiev regime, including regarding the persecution of followers of the canonical Orthodox Church, you attempt to not notice this. I leave no doubt that even when the regime begins to grab people off the streets and summarily execute those dissenters, those who disagree with the destructive anti-popular policy of the current authorities, is something which you will easily turn a blind eye to. But we will dwell on this in detail during the 26th July meeting we requested. I wish to touch upon another 2 issues which have to do with the Ukrainian subject. Exactly 9 years ago, in the skies of Donbass, the MH17 Malaysian Airlines flight was downed. This event directly impacted the crisis inside Ukraine, forcing the Donbass insurgents with a military initiative to stop, in expectation of the imminent, as it seemed then, condemnation of Ukraine for the terrorist act that occurred. As is known, since this disaster, the Russian Federation consistently advocated comprehensive, thorough, impartial, apolitical investigation into the reasons behind the disaster based on facts and incontrovertible evidence. Russia was at the source of the adoption by the Security Council of Resolution 2166, stipulating the need to conduct a full, thorough, and independent international investigation. However, this has still not been carried out. The circumstances behind what has happened have not been credibly highlighted. The situation carried out by the Netherlands and the criminal investigation by the Joint Investigative Team did not reflect the criteria set out in Resolution 2166. Their real goal was not to establish the truth, but rather to tailor the relevant evidentiary basis to reflect the narrative of Russia's participation in the tragedy. Essentially, the MH17 disaster was nothing other than a key element of a mendacious, unfounded anti-Russia campaign, which was subsequently supplemented by the poisonings of Skripal and Navalny, as well as the Bucha provocation, which I've already mentioned. As is known, the worse and more horrific the lie, the easier it is to believe it. And this is specifically the principle that our Western opponents give pride of place to in all of these instances. On MH17, the Russian Federation provided the investigation with vast troves of information, which had tremendous significance to identify the true causes for the disaster. However, this material was taken into account neither by the investigation nor by the Hague District Court. They preferred dubious sources from social networks, photographs, and video material, which was evidently redacted. Not a single question was put to Ukraine, which refuted to provide radar data and recorded conversations of on-ground flight tracking services, and was unable to explain where the Ukrainian dispatchers who could have shed light on this tragedy, where they disappeared to. In the time that has elapsed since the disaster, there was no due consideration of the question of Kyiv's responsibility for opening airspace over the area of hostilities where air defenses, including Buks, were deployed. There was a particular clarity could have been introduced with U.S. satellite data, which were made on the day of the disaster. However, the judge's request to disclose this data, or at least allow access with compliance with certain conditions, were categorically denied by Washington. Unfortunately, the approach embraced by Netherlands and their cronies is showing the fact that there is a smokescreen. And in this connection, we cannot but sympathize with family and loved ones of the dead who are deliberately denied their right to truth. And not a single Western colleague mentioned this tragedy today. You don't need the facts or the truth about this, and your role in the practice of slandering the Russian Federation has already been carried out. And now, to conclude, I wish to touch upon another issue. Today, through Russian embassies in Ankara, Minsk, London, as well as the Consulate General in Istanbul, we circulated official notes about a decision made by the Russian government to end the Black Sea Initiative as of 18 July 2023. Similarly, UN Secretary General and head of OCHA were notified, and they are directly responsible for its implementation. I see no point in delving into the details of how the so-called Istanbul package of Antonio Guterres was actually being implemented, a key component of which is the Russia-UN memorandum. We've already done this repeatedly, including here at the Security Council chamber. Further, as we see now, empty promises, the Secretariat were continued to be carried out by the Secretariat. And however, against the backdrop of the stable export from Ukraine to countries with high-level income countries and middle-income countries of corn fodder and wheat fodder, 90% and 60% of all exports, respectively, least developed countries received only 3% of those goods, and the World Food Program humanitarian operations received even less of this, 2.2% of wheat. These facts are too unsavory, and they speak to themselves, and so the Black Sea Initiative was, without much ado, simply reformatted from a humanitarian to a commercial one. Against this backdrop, there remained unresolved issues that Russian economic operators continue to encounter. Having announced in March this year of our consent for the extension of the Black Sea Initiative for 60 days on 18 July, we categorically stated that we will take a decision on further steps only after consideration of progress in addressing certain tasks, which we spoke about repeatedly. I will not relist them. At the same time, we pay tribute to the Secretary General and his team for their efforts in attempting to persuade Western countries to comply with obligations before the Russian Federation from the Russia-UN memorandum. However, these were mere smoke and mirrors. However, there has been no progress here, and the Kiev regime continues to use the cover of the open maritime corridor to wage provocations and attacks against Russian civilians and military objects. Against this backdrop, a decision was taken for us to exit the deal, about which today we informed the Turkish and Ukrainian sides, as well as the UN Secretariat. This means an end to guarantees of safe navigation, curtailment of a maritime humanitarian corridor, restoration of a regime of a temporary dangerous area in the Northwest Black Sea, and reformatting of the Joint Coordination Center. And in this way, without Russia's participation, the Black Sea Initiative ends its operations as of 18 July. The Russian Federation will stand ready to consider its resumption only when concrete results are achieved, rather than promises and assurances from Western capitals. And now, apparently, is the time, clearly, to demonstrate the stated solidarity of Kyiv's European allies, who can export Ukrainian food through land corridors. For our part, despite the existing obstacles, we will continue to assume our obligation to fulfill contractual obligations to provide Russian grain to all purchasers. Thank you.